The winter of 1942 bit through flesh and bone like a predator that never slept. Across the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, the snow was black with soot and blood. A soldier, barely 20, tightened his torn coat and pressed his cheek against the frozen rifle stock. Somewhere ahead, the rattle of machine gun fire stitched the air. He didn't know whether he'd live another hour. He didn't even know if the city still existed beyond the next street. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just another fight in the vastness of World War II. It was the place where two empires met to decide the fate of the world, Hitler's dream of domination against Stalin's will to survive. By the time the smoke cleared, 2 million lives had been swallowed by this single city on the Volga River. But before the world called it the turning point, it was simply hell on earth. A battlefield where hunger was deadlier than bullets, and the frozen air itself became a weapon. Every brick, every street corner, every pile of rubble told a story, of courage, cruelty, and the will to endure when survival seemed impossible. This is that story. The story of Stalingrad. The moment when the tide of the Second World War began to turn. In the summer of 1942, Hitler believed victory was inevitable. France had fallen, the Balkans were his, and the German war machine had chewed deep into the Soviet Union. But the German army had one fatal flaw, its hunger for more. Oil. Resources. Glory. Hitler's eyes turned south, to the Caucasus oil fields, the beating heart of Soviet industry. And guarding that road lay a city whose name carried power of its own. Stalingrad. To take it meant humiliating Stalin himself. To lose it meant admitting that Germany could bleed. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with confidence. They believed the Red Army was broken, the Soviet spirit crushed. They were wrong. As the Germans moved closer to the Volga, the Soviets prepared for a fight not for land, but for existence. For every soldier, the message was clear. Not one step back. On August 23, 1942, Stalingrad became a furnace. More than 1,000 German aircraft roared across the sky, dropping over 1 million bombs. The city burned for days, factories, homes, hospitals, everything turned to ash. Tens of thousands died in the first 24 hours. Yet amid the flames, the Soviets refused to abandon the ruins. Workers turned into soldiers overnight. Women, children, and old men dug trenches and carried ammunition. The Volga River, once a symbol of trade and life, became a graveyard for ferries trying to cross under relentless shellfire. For the Germans, the destruction was supposed to make victory easy. Instead, it created a nightmare. The city's skeleton became the Soviets' armor. Every shattered wall turned into a fortress. Every cellar hid snipers waiting for the perfect breath. Street fighting reached a level the world had never seen. They called it rate-making, the Rat War. Combat was fought from room to room, floor to floor. A soldier could live and die within the same apartment building without ever seeing daylight again. In the chaos, heroism bloomed in impossible places. A young sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and his men defended a single apartment block for 58 days, without surrender, without food, often without sleep. Later, the Soviets would call it Pavlov's house, and Stalin himself would say, "It took more Germans to capture this house than to capture Paris." Welcome to War Chronicles, the home of history's fiercest struggles, told through the voices of those who endured them. Here, we don't just recite dates and numbers. We relive the fear, the strategy, and the choices that shaped humanity's darkest hours. From the ashes of Stalingrad to the sands of North Africa, from the jungles of Vietnam to the skies over Europe. Every story here is a fragment of who we are. So, if you believe history deserves to be felt, not just remembered, stay till the end. Because this is just the beginning. As September chilled the ruins, Soviet reinforcements poured across the Volga under fire. They came at night, in silence, their boats riddled with holes. Many never made it to shore. Those who did found a world made of smoke, steel, and ghosts. General Vasily Chuikov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, understood one thing. If the Germans captured the riverbank, Stalingrad would fall. So he gave his men an order that became legend: hold them so close they can't use their tanks or planes. His strategy turned the city into a grinder. The Germans' advantage in air power and artillery vanished inside the ruins. Snipers ruled the streets. Names like Vasily Zaitsev would become symbols of deadly patience. Zaitsev alone recorded more than 200 confirmed kills, turning the hunt for him into a psychological war. Both sides reached limits of endurance. Food disappeared, ammunition ran dry. Bodies froze where they fell. And yet, neither side would surrender. In Berlin, Hitler declared, "The city is taken. But in reality, the battle had only begun. Behind the lines, Soviet High Command prepared a secret counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, a plan to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. November 1942. The city was dying, but not defeated. For 3 months, the Germans had clawed at every block, every bridge, every bunker, thinking victory was within reach. But victory has a habit of changing sides when you least expect it. Deep beneath Moscow's cold stone, Soviet generals traced their fingers across maps lit by dim lamps. What the Germans didn't know was that their greatest strength, their confidence, had become their greatest weakness. They had pushed too far, too fast, too deep into Soviet territory. Their flanks, the sides of their massive army, were guarded not by Germans, but by exhausted Romanian and Italian troops who lacked winter gear, heavy weapons, and hope. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the mastermind behind the Soviet defense, saw this flaw like a crack in glass. If the Soviets could strike from both sides of Stalingrad, they could snap the German Sixth Army like a trap. The plan had a name that would echo through history: Operation Uranus. While Paulus's men fought and froze inside the ruins, 1 million Soviet troops gathered silently across the steppe. Tanks and guns were hidden under nets of snow and straw. Even the villagers nearby had no idea what was about to happen. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence broke. The ground shook as 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire in unison, a thunderstorm of steel stretching across 50 miles. Within hours, the Romanian lines began to collapse like paper walls. German officers inside Stalingrad couldn't believe it. Radio reports were chaos, calls for help, screams of retreat, commands lost in static. By nightfall, the Soviets had punched deep holes into the German supply lines. The trap was beginning to close. Inside the city, Paulus was ordered to hold his ground: no retreat, no movement. Hitler's voice crackled through the radio. Stalingrad must be taken, whatever the cost. But as his men shivered in basements, surrounded by frozen corpses and empty canteens, Paulus must have realized something chilling. He was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting for survival. The Soviet offensive struck like a thunderclap. In the north, General Rokossovsky's forces smashed through the Romanian Third Army. In the south, General Yeremenko's men hit the Romanian Fourth Army Corps. Both Soviet pincers moved swiftly toward each other, like jaws closing on a trapped prey. The Germans inside Stalingrad didn't understand at first. They believed the Soviets were retreating again. But within 2 days, the truth became clear. The Germans weren't advancing anymore, they were surrounded. More than 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped in an icy pocket around Stalingrad. They had food for 2 weeks, fuel for 1, and no chance of breaking out in his bunker. Paulus sent frantic messages to Hitler, begging for permission to retreat before the encirclement sealed. But the Führer's answer came cold and final. You will stand fast. The Sixth Army will be supplied by air. An airlift, Hitler's desperate fantasy. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies a day. They never managed more than 100. The soldiers began to starve. Bread rations shrank to a few ounces. Horses were slaughtered for food. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. One diary found later simply read: "We eat snow to forget hunger." Outside the pocket, Soviet troops tightened their grip. Tanks rolled across frozen rivers, and artillery thundered day and night. In Moscow, Stalin smiled grimly. For the first time in the war, the Red Army had the Germans exactly where it wanted them. Yet, in the ruins of Stalingrad, the soldiers still fought. Not for Hitler. Not for ideology. But because there was nowhere else to go. One German officer wrote in his journal: "We are not men anymore. We are shadows in the snow." By late December 1942, Stalingrad was a frozen grave. Snow covered the ruins like a shroud, hiding the thousands buried beneath. The trapped soldiers had no medicine, no warmth, and almost no hope. Even the Volga, once a symbol of endurance, had frozen solid. Still, Paulus refused to surrender. He had been promoted to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. Traditionally, no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The promotion was Hitler's message: die in Stalingrad, or don't come back. But outside the city, the Soviets were already preparing their final blow. Operation Ring, the closing act of Stalingrad, was designed to crush the encircled German Sixth Army once and for all. Inside the pocket, German discipline crumbled. Units dissolved. Officers stopped giving orders. Men burned books and furniture just to stay warm. Rumors spread that some were eating the dead. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets unleashed a final barrage, 7,000 guns firing simultaneously. The city shook as if the earth itself wanted the war to end. Street by street, the Red Army advanced. There was no fight left to give. By the end of January, the Germans had split into two pockets, north and south. On January 31st, Paulus was captured in a basement near the city center. He refused to kill himself. He refused to obey Hitler's order to die. When news reached Berlin, Hitler raged. What is the world coming to when a field marshal surrenders? But the world didn't care. The world had already changed. The invincible German army had been broken. For the first time, the myth of Nazi superiority had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. And from the ashes of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union would begin its march west. A march that would end in Berlin itself. The battle was over. But what remained was not a victory, it was a scar. Stalingrad, once a proud industrial city on the Volga, had become a wasteland of twisted steel and shattered souls. Every building had been burned, every street cratered, every wall scarred by gunfire. The snow was not white, it was gray with ashes and black with blood. When the Red Army walked through the ruins, they found more corpses than living men. German soldiers lay frozen in the positions they had died, rifles still clutched in stiff hands. Some were buried under collapsed buildings, others sat upright in trenches, eyes open, faces unrecognizable. Soviet soldiers looked around in silence. There was no cheer, no celebration, just disbelief. They had won, yes. But they had also lost more than anyone could count. Historians would later calculate. Over 2 million casualties combined, soldiers and civilians. Nearly 40,000 Soviet civilians dead. 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner. And an entire city erased from the map. One Soviet general would write. It was not a victory of glory. It was a victory of endurance. Even the sky seemed haunted. Smoke still rose from the ruins days after the guns had gone silent. The Volga River, once red with battle, now carried the silent dead beneath its frozen surface. Among the wreckage, a Soviet medic found a small, frozen diary, belonging to a German soldier named Hans. The last line read, "If anyone finds this, tell my mother, I fought until the end, but I no longer remember why." After Paulus surrendered, the Soviet soldiers herded the survivors, about 91,000 men, out of the ruins. They marched through the snow, past the same battlefields that had consumed them for months. Many could barely walk. Fell and never rose again, they were the ghosts of an army that had once believed it could conquer the world. Now, they were broken, starving, and frostbitten, heading east into captivity. The Soviets called it retribution. The Germans called it hell. Of those 91,000 men, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died in Soviet prison camps, from disease, exhaustion, or the crushing realization that their empire was lost. Paulus himself was treated differently. He was not executed, not tortured, but he was used. The Soviets turned him into a symbol of Nazi failure. In 1944, he even made radio broadcasts calling on German officers to surrender. The man who had once fought for Hitler now spoke against him. When the war finally ended in 1945, Paulus chose not to return to the West. He lived quietly in East Germany, haunted by Stalingrad until his death. One of his former soldiers, when asked about him years later, said, "He was not a coward. He was a man who learned too late that loyalty can kill." Cut to, slow piano notes, image of prisoners disappearing into snowy horizon. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military turning point. It was a moment when the course of human history shifted. Before Stalingrad, the world feared the German war machine. After Stalingrad, the myth of invincibility was shattered forever. From that winter onward, the Red Army began to push westward, through Ukraine, through Poland, through the heart of Germany itself. 2 years later, Soviet soldiers would raise their flag over the ruins of Berlin. A final echo of the revenge that began on the banks of the Volga. But Stalingrad's story did more than change borders, it changed people. It showed the world the price of blind ambition and the endurance of those who refused to fall. The battle became a symbol, not of victory, but of sacrifice. When you walk through modern-day Volgograd, the city once called Stalingrad, you can still feel it. The air carries the weight of memory. The motherland calls. Statue towers above the city, her sword raised toward the sky. A reminder that freedom is not born from peace, but from struggle. And so, as the cold wind moves across the Volga, the whispers of the past still echo through the ruins. We stood here. We fought. We endured. In every great battle, before a single shot is fired, a quieter war takes place, the war of decisions. At Stalingrad, 4 men played that game on a board of blood and snow: Hitler, Paulus, Stalin, and Zhukov. Far from the ruins and the cold, Adolf Hitler sat in his mountain fortress, convinced that sheer will could bend reality. His generals warned him the Sixth Army was overextended, that winter was closing in, that supply lines were broken. But Hitler didn't hear warnings, he heard excuses. To him, retreat was betrayal. He once said, "A German soldier can do anything if he believes in me." Belief, however, could not stop the Russian winter. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, was a man of precision, calm, disciplined, methodical. But Stalingrad was chaos, not mathematics. He followed every order, every command from Berlin, even as his army bled to death around him. To disobey meant dishonor. To obey meant destruction. And so, he obeyed. On the other side of the war map sat Joseph Stalin, cold, calculating, and equally ruthless. To him, the defense of Stalingrad was not about the city itself, it was about pride, morale, and revenge. He issued Order No. 227, not one step back. It meant exactly what it said. Any soldier who retreated without orders would be shot. Behind Soviet lines, blocking detachments waited, not to fight the Germans, but to shoot their own if they tried to flee. And then there was Marshal Georgy Zhukov. He didn't shout like Stalin or fantasize like Hitler. He planned. He understood that Stalingrad was not just a city, it was the perfect trap. While Paulus fought house by house in the ruins, Zhukov quietly gathered more than 1 million troops on the frozen plains around him. Every gun, every tank, every piece of artillery was moved into position under snow and silence. In late October 1942, Soviet intelligence intercepted German communications confirming that the Sixth Army expected reinforcements, not an attack. It was exactly what Zhukov needed. He told Stalin, "Let them dig deeper. The deeper they go, the harder it will be to pull them out." Stalin approved the plan. Operation Uranus was set into motion. In a single moment, the fate of hundreds of thousands was sealed, not by bullets, not by courage, but by decisions made far from the battlefield. The commanders had played their moves. Now, the soldiers would pay the price. In December 1942, the German Sixth Army was already dying, but Berlin refused to hear its death cries. Inside Hitler's headquarters, reports of shortages and starvation were rewritten before reaching his desk. He did not want facts, he wanted faith. When Field Marshal von Manstein proposed a breakout, Hitler slammed his hand on the map. "The Sixth Army will hold its ground," he said. "And the Air Force will supply them. Stalingrad will stand as a fortress. A fortress without food. A fortress without fuel. A fortress without hope." General Friedrich Paulus read the order in silence. Outside, the temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. His men burned crates, doors, even books to stay warm. Engines froze. Guns jammed. Every breath turned to ice in the air. He radioed Berlin again, "Immediate breakout necessary. Ammunition and rations nearly exhausted." The reply came hours later, short, final, merciless. "Stand fast. The Führer trusts in you." Trust was not enough to fill empty stomachs. The promised airlift was a disaster. The Luftwaffe could manage barely a fifth of the supplies needed each day. Planes were shot down, lost in blizzards, or landed on runways buried in snow. Every crate that reached the city was a miracle, every missing one, a death sentence. In his diary, a German officer wrote, "We live like moles beneath the ruins. We eat soup made of snow and candle wax." Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin and Zhukov listened to intercepted German messages. They knew their enemy's lifeline was collapsing. Zhukov turned to his aides and said simply, "Let them freeze. We will crush them when they stop moving." Inside Stalingrad, Paulus's discipline began to crumble. Officers whispered of mutiny. Medical staff ran out of morphine. Frostbite turned soldiers' fingers black. Some shot themselves rather than face amputation without anesthesia. Still, Paulus refused to disobey. He was a man trained to obey orders, and his last order had come from Hitler himself. To break it would mean treason. To follow it would mean annihilation. By Christmas 1942, the men of the Sixth Army decorated a frozen pine branch with scraps of tin and paper. They sang carols softly in the ruins. When dawn came, the singing stopped, replaced by the sound of Soviet shells. The fortress of Stalingrad was no longer a fortress, it was a tomb waiting to close. In the Kremlin, far from the front, Joseph Stalin listened to reports with a face that never moved. For him, Stalingrad was not simply a battle, it was a test of the Soviet soul. He believed that fear could be stronger than courage, if fear was aimed in the right direction. Early in the war, he had signed Order Number 227, its first words burned into every commander's memory. Not one step back. Behind every Soviet division, blocking detachments waited with loaded rifles. But when it failed, silence fell over the ruins. A few officers asked Paulus to attempt a breakout. They were not there to fight the Germans, they were there to shoot any Soviet soldier who tried to run. The logic was brutal but simple. Better to lose men to discipline than to panic. When news reached Stalin that the Germans were pushing toward the Volga, he did not shout. He quietly asked one question. Can we make them bleed enough before the river freezes? That was the essence of his strategy. He did not seek glory, he sought exhaustion. Every factory worker, every farmer, every soldier became part of a single machine built to grind the invader down. While Stalin ruled by fear, Marshal Georgy Zhukov ruled by precision. He studied German tactics like a surgeon studying a disease. He knew the Wehrmacht's strength was speed, so he gave them the illusion of progress. He ordered controlled retreats, then sudden counterattacks that swallowed entire battalions. When the first German tanks reached the Volga, Zhukov was already thinking months ahead. He wanted the enemy trapped in the city's ruins, where their tanks were useless and their supply lines hopeless. To him, Stalingrad was not a tragedy, it was a design. Stalin visited the operations room one night in October 1942. The lamps flickered, frost crept down the windows. He looked at the red arrows drawn across the map and said to Zhukov, "Comrade Marshal, if this fails, there will be no retreat." Zhukov simply nodded. It will not fail. Outside, on the front lines, the cost of that confidence was measured in blood. Entire companies were ordered to attack without rifles, picking up weapons from the fallen. Rations were thin, boots were torn, yet morale hardened rather than broke. Propaganda posters called the defenders the wall on the Volga. The wall would hold, or die standing. By November, when Operation Uranus began, the Soviet soldiers no longer fought just for orders or ideology. They fought because there was nothing else left but the city behind them and the frozen steppe ahead. Zhukov's plan unleashed the fury that months of suffering had stored. Within days, the trap closed, and the once invincible German Sixth Army became prisoners of their own ambition. Stalin's method was merciless, Zhukov's vision cold, but together they achieved what no army had done before. They turned survival itself into a weapon. Winter crept across Stalingrad like a ghost. The city was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard still pretending to live. The walls whispered when the wind blew through the shattered bricks. Somewhere in the ruins, a child's toy still rang when kicked by a passing soldier. Civilians who had refused to leave the city now lived underground, in basements, sewers, and collapsed tram tunnels. They had no electricity, no medicine, barely any food. Water came from melted snow or the Volga itself, fetched at night under sniper fire. People stopped counting days, they counted nights survived. Among the rubble, Soviet soldiers shared those cellars with the last families left alive. A private might hand a crust of bread to a woman who hadn't eaten in 2 days. In return, she'd whisper, "You must win, or we are all ghosts." Those words traveled faster than any radio signal. They reminded the soldiers that the city behind them still had a heartbeat. In one of those ruins, near what was once Red October steel factory, a group of Soviet snipers waited. Their rifles were wrapped in cloth to keep from freezing to their hands. Among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from the Ural Mountains. He had already become a legend, the man who could turn a single bullet into vengeance. Zaitsev would later recall. The Germans had better food, better clothes, but we had better reason. He and his comrades hunted enemy officers one by one, using the twisted ruins as camouflage. Their rifles became extensions of the city itself, cold, patient, and unforgiving. Every German who fell reminded the others that Stalingrad was not dead, it was watching them. Even the German soldiers began to whisper. They had come to Stalingrad as conquerors, now they scavenged horse meat and frost-bitten bread. Some still carried letters from home, unopened for weeks. One note, found later on a frozen body, read, "My dearest Karl, do you still see the stars above Russia?" But in Stalingrad, there were no stars anymore, only smoke. The sky itself seemed to have given up. Inside the ruins, language didn't matter anymore. Soviet soldiers, German soldiers, and civilians all shared the same silent prayers. For warmth, for food, for the sound of silence instead of shellfire. Even hatred began to fade, replaced by something deeper, exhaustion, the kind that no ideology could survive. As the temperature dropped below -30 degrees, the Volga froze solid. Bodies, once buried under snow, began to surface again as the wind scraped away the cover. Some soldiers carved names into the ice with their bayonets, not of enemies, but of brothers lost. It was their way of refusing to disappear that I in the heart of that frozen nightmare, whispers moved from mouth to mouth. The Germans are trapped. Reinforcements are coming. We might survive this. Hope in Stalingrad was not loud. It was a whisper, and it refused to die. It began quietly, not with a roar, but with a tremor. On November 19, 1942, the frozen steppes north of Stalingrad shook beneath thousands of Soviet guns. Flashes lit the horizon like a storm made of fire. The soldiers who saw it said it looked as if the earth itself had turned against the Germans. This was Operation Uranus, a plan months in the making. While the Germans believed the Soviets were nearly broken, Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky had hidden entire armies beyond the horizon. They didn't attack the German elite. Instead, they struck the flanks, where Romanian and Italian troops, poorly equipped and freezing, tried to hold the line. Within hours, the defense collapsed. The Soviets poured through the gaps, their tanks painted white with frost and snow. The German officers inside Stalingrad radioed Berlin. Enemy armor advancing from the north and south. We require immediate reinforcement. No reinforcements came. Within 4 days, the two Soviet fronts met near the town of Kalach. A steel ring closed around the German Sixth Army, 300,000 men trapped in a city of ruins. That at first, the German commander, General Friedrich Paulus, refused to believe it. He had been promised air support, that the Luftwaffe could supply the army from the sky. But reality had other plans. Snowstorms swallowed the planes, engines froze, and what little supplies arrived were barely enough for a single day. The men inside Stalingrad began to starve. They boiled horse bones to make soup. They tore insulation from the walls to burn for warmth. Letters home turned desperate. We are surrounded. We live like moles beneath the ruins. If you receive this, know that I fought until the end. Outside the ring, Soviet troops watched as the trap tightened. Zhukov forbade direct assaults, he preferred time to do the killing. He told his officers, "The enemy is no longer an army. He is a wound that will bleed until spring." Days turned into weeks. The snow buried tanks, frozen in place like monuments. Inside the encirclement, discipline began to fracture. Some German soldiers still saluted every morning, others sat staring into the distance, lips cracked from the cold. By Christmas 1942, the once mighty Sixth Army was dying on its feet. They celebrated the holiday with candle stubs and crumbs of bread. Some still believed rescue would come, that Field Marshal Manstein's counterattack would break the ring. He refused. Hitler had ordered, "Stalingrad must be held. Not one man is to leave." And so they stayed, frozen by obedience, surrounded by fate. From the sky, Soviet pilots reported the sight of thousands of campfires. Not from life, but from dying men trying to stay warm. The ring was now a tomb. Zhukov watched from his map room and whispered to his aide, "This is how empires die, not with a shot, but with silence." By January 1943, Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a frozen grave, a place where even time seemed afraid to move. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, had been reduced to fragments of starving men huddled in basements and ruins. Ammunition gone. Supplies gone. The wounded freeze where they fall. General Friedrich Paulus sat in the cellar of the Univermag department store, now his headquarters, buried beneath rubble. The map before him no longer showed movement, only red lines closing tighter with each passing hour. He had no contact with Berlin except for one final message. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will fight to the last man and the last bullet. But there were no bullets left. On January 31st, Soviet troops stormed the building. When they found Paulus, he was pale, unshaven, and silent, the first German field marshal ever captured alive. He looked at the Soviet officer and said quietly, "I have no orders. My men are finished." That was how the longest, bloodiest battle in modern history ended. The numbers defy imagination. Of the 300,000 German troops trapped in Stalingrad, fewer than 100,000 were captured alive. Only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The Soviet victory came at a price beyond measure, nearly 1 million soldiers and civilians dead, wounded, or missing. Yet for the first time, the Nazi war machine had been broken. The myth of invincibility shattered on the banks of the Volga. Across the Soviet Union, church bells rang. In villages where sons had not returned, mothers still wept, but this time, the tears fell on victory, not defeat. In Berlin, Hitler refused to speak of Stalingrad. He ordered no day of mourning, no message of condolence. For him, it was not just a defeat, it was betrayal by fate itself. But for the world, Stalingrad became something else entirely. The moment when the tide of the Second World War turned east to west, when spring came, the ice melted, and the Volga flowed again. Farmers returning to the ruins found fields filled with metal, helmets, rifles, bones. Children played among the wreckage, too young to understand that beneath their feet lay an empire's broken dream. One Soviet veteran, years later, said, "We did not win because we were stronger. We won because we refused to disappear." And so, in the ruins of Stalingrad, the future began. Not with triumph, but with the quiet promise that no city, no people, would ever surrender so easily again. When the guns finally fell silent over Stalingrad, the city did not cheer, it simply exhaled. What had once been a proud industrial center on the Volga was now a skeleton made of brick and ash. Every street was lined with rubble, every basement held a story no one dared to tell. The Soviets called it a victory beyond measure. But for those who survived, victory was a strange word. They looked around and saw nothing left to win. The living began the slow work of finding the dead. Teams of soldiers and civilians searched through the ruins, pulling bodies from snowdrifts, identifying them by scraps of cloth, medals, or dog tags. The air smelled of dust, gunpowder, and frozen decay. In one corner of the shattered city, a Red Army nurse wrote in her diary, "The silence frightens me more than the shelling ever did." Of the German soldiers who surrendered, few would ever see their homes again. They were marched eastward through blizzards and hunger, a long column of shadows stretching across the white steppe. Those who fell behind were left where they dropped. For many, Russia itself became their grave. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol greater than the men who fought there. Posters appeared across cities and towns. Stalingrad, the heart of the motherland. The name alone became a warning to every invader, a promise that no enemy would ever pass unpunished. But the victory carried invisible scars. Entire families had vanished. Children grew up without fathers. And mothers learned to smile through tears when medals replaced the men they loved. On the airwaves, Stalin's voice declared, "Comrades, our army has triumphed. The fascist beast is broken." Crowds cheered. Yet many who listened held memories too heavy to celebrate. They remembered the hunger, the nights of fire, and the faces of friends who would never wake again. In Germany, the shock was equally deep. Families received letters marked "missing in action" near Stalingrad. Some refused to believe their sons were dead. They waited for years, clinging to the hope that one day, someone would come walking out of the east. As years passed, the ruins of Stalingrad became a pilgrimage site. Veterans returned, some to honor, some to weep. Grass grew between the wrecks of tanks, and the Volga flowed quietly beside them. Indifferent, eternal. One old soldier, standing by the river, was heard to whisper, "We thought we were fighting for our leaders, but really, we were fighting for time, for the right to see another sunrise." Today, the city bears another name, Volgograd. But the spirit of Stalingrad has never left. It lives in the dust, the monuments, the silence that still hangs over the river. Every gust of wind carries echoes of the battle, voices of those who never came home, still marching through history. And so ends the story, not of victory, but of endurance. The ghosts of the Volga still whisper, not of war, but of the price of survival. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943. But its shockwaves traveled farther than any bullet. What began on the banks of the Volga soon echoed across the entire world. Before Stalingrad, the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. From Paris to the Caucasus, Hitler's banners had swept across Europe like a tide. After Stalingrad, that tide began to retreat. In London, Winston Churchill called it the end of the beginning. In Washington, American generals studied the Soviet victory with astonishment. They realized that the German army, once thought invincible, could be bled, cornered, and broken. Soon after, in the deserts of North Africa, British and American forces struck at the German Afrika Korps under Rommel. The battle names changed, El Alamein, Kasserine Pass, Tunis. But the meaning was the same. The empire that had once advanced on every front was now being pushed back, step by step. The psychological impact of Stalingrad reached even into Hitler's own headquarters. For the first time, his generals began to doubt him. Meetings once filled with obedience were now heavy with silence. Hitler no longer trusted his commanders. He trusted only his rage. In the east, Soviet morale soared. Factories that had been dismantled and moved beyond the Urals now worked day and night, producing tanks, planes, and shells. The Red Army that had nearly perished in 1941 was reborn, stronger, harder, and unafraid. From Stalingrad, the Soviets began to advance westward through the ruins of Kharkov, then Kursk, and eventually, the long road toward Berlin itself. Every step was paved with memory, a reminder of what had been lost, and what would never be surrendered again. Meanwhile, in the occupied territories of Europe, resistance movements found new courage. The myth of the invincible Reich had been shattered by the freezing wind of the Volga. Men and women who once hid in fear now carried weapons in the forests of Poland, France, and Yugoslavia. They whispered a single word of hope: Stalingrad. Even in the United States, newsreels showed images of the ruined city. Audiences sat in silence as the narrator's voice spoke of heroic defense and inevitable victory. For many, Stalingrad was more than a city. It was proof that the world could fight back. By the summer of 1943, the German army launched one last desperate offensive, Operation Citadel, at a place called Kursk. But the Soviets were ready. Stalingrad had taught them how to absorb the blow, how to endure the storm until it broke itself. When the Battle of Kursk ended, Germany's fate was sealed. From that moment, the war would only move in one direction: toward Berlin and toward the fall of the Third Reich. Yet even as armies advanced, those who had survived Stalingrad knew something deeper. They knew that wars are not truly won by maps or medals, but by the hearts that refuse to break. The war beyond Stalingrad was not just about victory. It was about revenge, redemption, and remembrance, a march that began in the ashes of one city and ended in the ruins of another. When the war ended, the world called Stalingrad a miracle. But to those who returned, it looked nothing like one. There were no streets, only trenches filled with rubble. The Volga flowed quietly past a landscape where even trees had burned down to black stumps. The city had to be rebuilt from memory, because almost nothing remained to rebuild from. The survivors came first: soldiers, widows, and children. They returned with shovels, carts, and bare hands. Every brick that could be salvaged was cleaned and reused. Every surviving wall became a foundation for something new. They slept in dugouts, worked by daylight, and sang old wartime songs while laying the first stones of the new city. A woman named Anna Petrova, who had worked as a nurse during the siege, wrote in her diary, "We build not for comfort but to prove that we still exist." In 1945, Stalin declared that the new Stalingrad would become a hero city, a living monument to Soviet courage. Plans were drawn for grand avenues, statues, and memorials. Engineers came from Moscow, artists from Leningrad, each carrying the same silent goal: to turn ruin into pride. But beneath the slogans and speeches, the real work was done by hands hardened by war. Women lifted beams twice their weight. Orphans carried buckets of sand. Men who had fought at the front now fought against the ruins of their own homes. By the 1950s, the skyline began to rise again. Factories rebuilt, trams returning, schools echoing with the sound of new generations. Yet the ground beneath those buildings was heavy with ghosts. Every time workers dug foundations, they found helmets, bones, or fragments of uniforms. No one spoke much about it. They would bury what they found, make the sign of the cross, and keep building. In 1967, the Soviet Union unveiled a monument that would become world famous: the Motherland Calls. A colossal woman carved in stone, sword raised high over the hill of Mamiev Kurgan, where tens of thousands had died. She stood not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a reminder of sacrifice. When the wind passed through the statue's steel ribs, it made a low, mournful sound, almost like the breathing of the earth itself. Visitors came from all over the world to see her. Some brought flowers, others tears. Every Soviet schoolchild learned her story, and every veteran saw in her eyes the memory of those who never returned. As decades passed, the city changed its name, from Stalingrad to Volgograd, but not its identity. Older residents still called it by its wartime name. And each year, on February 2nd, sirens would sound for 1 minute at noon. Everyone, even drivers on the highways, would stop and stand in silence, because Stalingrad was not just a place. It was a heartbeat carved into the stones of time. It proved that even from total ruin, a city and a people could be reborn. Time moved forward. The soldiers who had fought at Stalingrad became old men. Their medals gathered dust in drawers, and the city they once saved grew bright and modern. But even as new buildings rose, the shadow of that winter never fully disappeared. For decades, every Soviet household knew the name Stalingrad. It was printed in textbooks, sung in songs, etched into stone and memory alike. Children learned not only about the tanks and battles, but about the courage that defined their grandparents' generation. Films turned the battle into legend. The heroes had names, faces, and perfect lines of dialogue. In black and white reels, Soviet soldiers charged bravely through smoke, and victory music drowned out the screams that history preferred to forget. Reality was reshaped, pain turned into pride, and fear transformed into a lesson of loyalty. Yet for those who had truly been there, the movies felt too clean. They remembered the hunger, the cold, the sound of bones breaking under snow. Many veterans refused to speak. Some said they couldn't find the words. Others said the silence itself was more truthful. As the decades passed, the grandchildren of those veterans began to ask questions. What was it really like? Did you ever see Stalingrad burn? The old men would pause, look into the distance, and answer softly. It wasn't fire that destroyed the city, it was time. Because the real wounds of Stalingrad were not in its walls, but in the people who carried it inside them. In the late 20th century, as the Soviet Union began to crumble, Stalingrad's legacy took on new meaning. It was no longer just a symbol of victory. It became a reminder of unity, of what the people could achieve when the world was falling apart. When Volgograd streets filled with protests and uncertainty, old veterans stood quietly by the monuments, watching history repeat itself in different colors. One was asked by a journalist if he regretted the past. He smiled faintly and said, "Regret? No. But I wish people remembered what it cost." Outside Russia, the name Stalingrad took on its own legend. In Germany, it became a word spoken in mourning, a wound that never fully healed. In the West, it was studied in military academies as a lesson in overreach and endurance. In Hollywood, it was retold through filters of drama and spectacle. But no matter how it was told, the truth remained unchanged. At Stalingrad, humanity had reached both its darkest and its bravest hour. Even today, in Volgograd's quiet neighborhoods, children play where soldiers once fought. They run across the same ground, where empires collided, unaware that beneath their feet lie thousands who never came home. The echoes of Stalingrad live on in every generation that remembers, not through war stories or parades, but through the unspoken truth that survival itself is a kind of victory. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than a fight for a city. It was the moment the world realized that wars are not won by strength alone, but by endurance, intelligence, and will. When the smoke cleared in early 1943, both sides stood in shock at what had been done. 2 million men and women, soldiers, civilians, medics, and engineers, had been consumed by the fire of Stalingrad.